So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Dr. Andrew Roth, a scholar-in-residence at the Jefferson. Now, prior to joining the Jefferson team, Dr. Roth had an accomplished career in academia. From lecturing to leading, he's taught various courses before going on to serve in administrations in Erie and to lead Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president before retiring and then being named President Emeritus. Failing at retirement, as he often puts it, he then went on to serve as the interim president at St. Bonaventure University. Succeeding at failing again, we wrangled him in. He let us wrangle him into the Jefferson, and he has been facilitating the Ramey Fellowship Program and offering a wide range of lectures for us, from looks Washington to Hamilton, to the Jesuits to Lincoln, to the American Tapestry Project. Dr. Roth has also been writing weekly installments of his Book Notes series, in which he explores a wide range of topics there, from leadership to revisiting high school classics and more. But notably, Dr. Roth has helped us rewind the clock 52 years now, as he has spent a year lecturing on 1968 last year, a year many of us came to know, the year that America shattered, as Smithsonian Magazine declared and Dr. Roth reminded us. But did it shatter? Perhaps a bit ahead of his time, Dr. Roth offered 8 lectures at the Jefferson examining just that, and an additional 5 at the Chautauqua Institution, and 4 at the Siegel Institute of Case Western Reserve, and numerous other places. Now, I said ahead of his time because today many are reflecting on 1968 and its impact, and much comparison is being drawn between 1968 and 2020. Here to review his 1968 series in a condensed program, 1968, The Far Side of the Moon and the Birth of the Culture Wars, Dr. Roth will unpack 1968, why it is a year worthy of study, from politics as theater to angry partisanship, to race in America to culture wars, all of the issues that we're discussing and exploring here in 2020, and much, much more. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. We're going to do our best to get through as many as we can. If you happen to be watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us questions, and we'll do our best to get them along to Dr. Roth. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please do visit our website, www.jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Andrew Roth, thanks for joining me for this discussion.
Ben, I'm really glad to be with you again. I think it may be 2-3 weeks ago, we explored 1968, comparing it to 2020, picking up on an article James Fallows wrote in The Atlantic. A number of people have asked us and asked me what's so important about 1968. So here we are doing a reprise. And I would tell the audience, this is a 45 minute, hopefully closer to 40 than 45 minute, highly condensed version of a 6-hour, 4 or 5 part multimedia experience. And we're not going to have the music and the videos, both in the interest of time and also respecting some other issues. But we will cover everything. And right now I'm going to share screen and put up a PowerPoint, and hopefully I do this correctly and we can do this very efficiently. And you right now should be looking at a title page, The Far Side of the Moon and the Birth of the Culture Wars.
That's fantastic.
America in 1968. So, America in 1968. Why America in 1968? What's so important about America in 1968? Why is everyone talking about it 52 years later? And when Ben said that a couple of minutes ago, 52 years ago, I had to smile. You might have noticed me smiling and a slight chuckle, because that was the year I graduated from college. So I have a particular interest in this year for a whole variety of reasons. But nonetheless, why America in 1968? Why did the young job interviewee in a famous New Yorker cartoon boast that he was born in 1968, a very prestigious year? What did Hannah Arendt, the great political philosopher, what did she mean when she said, and she said this about 1971, 72, it seems to me that the children of the next century will once learn about 1968 the way we learned about 1848. And without getting into all of the nuances, 1848 is sometimes called the year of revolutions, the springtime of nations in Europe. It was a revolutionary year in Europe. Most of those revolutions, in fact, all of them failed, but they have great historical significance because most historians would tell you they signal the beginning of the end of the age of monarchy. They also had an impact on American history because many of the German revolutionaries emigrated to the United States, probably most famously Carl Schurz. But in any event, what did Hannah Arendt mean? Why was that job interviewee boasting? Why is 1968 so important? Well, the simple answer, the next 50 years and beyond were all foreshadowed. I intentionally use the word foreshadowed because you can't say things that happened in 1968 necessarily caused these things or had their origin there. Many of these issues go way back in American history. In fact, they're foundational issues that to this day have not been resolved. But it would be fair, I think, to say, and that's why many commentators call 1968 the worst year in modern American history. 2020 seems to want to give it a run for its money, but so far 1968 I think is still out in front. What happened? Well, in 1968, politics is theater. The presidential election of 1968 and its aftermath, race in America, civil rights and white backlash, the women's rights movement morphed into women's liberation. And then, of course, 1968 was probably the hinge year, the apex year of the counterculture, the youth rebellion, the exaltation of the individual, rapidly changing sexual mores, new spirituality. And of course, you really can't understand that era. I would submit you can't understand almost any era unless you understand its music. But that era in particular is drenched in music, and music really reveals it. And then lastly, media. We will take a look later and see that in 1968, America passed some cusp on a media arc. So, how did I get interested in this? Ben asked me this just before we began. I got interested in all of this other than the obvious reason I graduated from college in 1968 and was keenly aware of everything that was going on around me. Somewhat of a participant and somewhat not of a participant in much of that, but nonetheless, I was there. But in addition to that obvious thing, several years ago, and I think as Ben and I were chatting, that we at the Jefferson were a little bit ahead of the curve. We started talking about this 4 or 5 years ago and doing presentations. And we're finding that the rest of the world, I don't mean that as a boast, just a simple statement, is also now focusing on 1968 and what has it got to say to us about today. Well, I began thinking about this in 2016 during that rather tumultuous presidential election as I began working on a project I called the American, or at least I originally called the American Story Project. I now call it the American Tapestry Project, about what does it mean to be an American? What is the American story? And much of the confusion around that, of course, goes way back in American history, but found its flashpoint in 1968. So what happened in 1968 to set all of this in motion? What happened in 1968? Well, first the what's. Now, I don't expect you to read this rather busy screen, and I'm not going to read it to you. But part of the reason I did it this way was to just show you the chaos, the rapid fire, month, week after week, day after day, just unfolding of events that just didn't stop, starting with the Tet Offensive in January, going through the Memphis sanitation workers strike in February, Walter Cronkite's coming back from Vietnam in February saying we're in stalemate, McCarthy's. He did not upset Lyndon Johnson, contrary to myth. He got beat by Lyndon Johnson, 48, I think 49% to 42, but that he got 42% of the vote against the sitting president was tantamount to an upset. The My Lai massacre, tragically, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, the student uprising at Columbia, Alice's Restaurant in July, draft card burning day, the Pope bans birth control, riots in the streets, Richard Nixon says, "Sock it to me," women protest Miss America pageant, the Black Power salute at the Mexico Olympics, Shirley Chisholm's the first African-American woman elected to Congress, Richard Nixon wins the presidency by 7/10 of a vote, a little bit bigger margin in the Electoral College. In December, the Hong Kong flu begins to spike. Hong Kong flu is essentially a 1969 event. And on Christmas Eve, 1968, astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Anders circle the moon and become the first humans in all of history to see, hence one of our titles, the far side of the moon and Earthrise. That's the what's. Now the whys. That's Earthrise, by the way, in your lower right-hand corner, but I suspect almost everyone who's tuning in today has seen that. That's probably arguably the most famous photograph in the history of photography. If it's not, it would be on the very short list. Anyways, the 6 whys: politics is angry partisanship, race in America, women's rights, counterculture, music, 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 and mediated. And I don't mean mediated in the sense of labor negotiation. I mean mediated as a synonym for medicated. The mediated medicated, or medicated mediated America. So those are the whys. Let's take a look at those over this next half hour or so. Politics is theater and angry partisanship. Well, politics is theater and angry partisanship didn't begin in 1968. It's as old as Washington buying drinks when he was running to the House of Burgesses. It's as old as Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, FDR and his $1 Million Smile. But if it didn't begin in 1968 was the year it blossomed. One might say it had its conception, and I got a slide ahead of myself here. One might say it had its conception in 1967 and was born in all its fullness in Richard Nixon's 1968 campaign. In one of those chance meetings, and I don't know if you can see the arrow. Yes, I can see it. I don't know if the audience can, the cursor arrow. And one of thales chance meetings that bends history, in 1967 in the makeup room prepping for the Mike Douglas show, Richard Nixon met a young Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes was working then as the director-producer of the Mike Douglas show. Nixon told Ailes he hated television with all of its phoniness and makeup. Ailes had the temerity to tell Nixon he didn't know what he was talking about, that he'd botched the 1960 election because he didn't understand television. Television was the future. The future was all television, and Ailes would teach him. Nixon listened, hired Ailes, and as Joe McGinnis recounts in The Selling of the President, Ailes reinvented presidential politics as a variation on consumer advertising. And so it has been ever since. Ailes said Nixon would be the last politician elected president. All the rest would be performers. We could do an episode or a program on that, just looking at all the presidents since Nixon and asking which one of them were legitimate leaders and which of them were simply performers. Ailes invented the political infomercial in which Nixon posed in town hall meetings with allegedly randomly recruited citizens answering impartial questions, which in fact were prescribed questions. Ailes recast the election from anti-Vietnam. The election began all about the war in Vietnam. Ailes recast it as an issue of law and order, which has some similarities to 2020. Ailes recast it as law and order, and they did a very, very subtle advertising campaign. I would show you this video, but you can't hear the audio. This is one of the most famous of the Nixon ads of a lone woman walking down a dark, rainy, dampened street with an ominous narrator talking about the safety of citizens and how it's the obligation of government and leadership to protect its citizens. If it fails to protect its citizens, it's failed in its most fundamental duty. It worked. Nixon won. Every cable news talking head owes their career to William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal, whose acid-laced exchanges covering 1968's conventions invented a new genre of TV news. Actually, not news, but a quasi-news commentary show in which the commentary then becomes the news, which subsequent news shows then debate in a media version of a perpetual motion machine. In essence, one of the more banal but powerfully influential examples of what Daniel Bernstein called a pseudo-event, a contrived situation sculpted to the media's requirements that then becomes its own story, which finds its ultimate expression in today's social media cluttered world in a president who tweets, which tweets then become the subject of the news, the analysis of which in an ever-expanding self-referential spiral becomes the news of the day until the next tweet. There were at least 3 other consequences of the 1968 presidential election, each of which, by the way, could be a Jefferson presentation. Number 1, party purity. Prior to 1968, one could argue there were 4 parties in America: Northern liberal Democrats and Southern conservative Democrats. Eastern liberal Republicans and Western conservative Republicans. Post-1968, we've had increasingly more or less ideologically pure parties, liberal progressive Democrats, conservative Republicans with no need to bargain with one another. The old order required coalition building. The new order requires party purity and a beggar thy opponent partisanship. Time does not permit us to explain how this happened, but it's essentially the result of direct primary elections picking party candidates and how that has changed the whole dynamic. The smoke-filled room had more than a few flaws, but it also had some virtues. Loss of faith in government. Whoops, let's go back. Went too quick. Loss of faith in government. Anti-government sentiment is in the American DNA. We were founded in rebellion against the established order. But post-1968 America has, in some sense, never recovered from the twin hammers of Vietnam, in which Americans discovered the government could be wrong, just flat out wrong, and lie to protect itself. In Watergate, in which the highest levels of government could be involved in a criminal conspiracy and lie to cover it up. Although its origins predate 1968, this loss of faith in government has led to continuous campaigns in which candidates run against government itself, undermining the ability of government to govern. And then, lastly, the end of the liberal consensus. There really was, once upon a time, such a thing. It consisted of two macro concepts. In foreign affairs, America's global role as protector of democracy and liberty, as chief restrainer of communism, and as chief arbiter of the world economic order. In domestic affairs, it was an essential, if uneasy, bipartisan acceptance of FDR's New Deal. That began to unravel post-1968. Actually, it began to unravel in 1960, 1958 midterms, and then most importantly, 1964, Goldwater's entire campaign was a campaign against the liberal consensus, a choice, not an echo. But it really began to unravel post-1968. Although in a great irony, Richard Nixon, regardless of his campaign methods, governed as a centrist. In fact, it might be argued, in fact, it has been argued, that Richard Nixon was the last liberal. Why number two? Race in America. In 1968, the civil rights progress of the late 1950s, early 1960s was checked and then stalled. The 1960s saw three great pieces of civil rights legislation. These are Lyndon Johnson's great triumphs. If it were not for the war in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson would be considered one of the great presidents in American history. And if in fact the current beginnings of a racial reconciliation post-Floyd this spring, if in fact that continues to move forward with any kind of progress or success, and as the war in Vietnam recedes in history and recedes in importance, Johnson may again begin to rise in the rankings of the greatest presidents. And if he does, it'll be because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But 1968's presidential election began the slowing down of that progress. The election, as I said a minute ago, began all about Vietnam. Beginning, however, with LBJ's withdrawal on March 31st, the assassination of Martin Luther King on April 4th, and then Robert F. Kennedy giving one of the great impromptu speeches in American political history that evening. But beginning with the assassination of Martin Luther King, the ensuing nationwide urban riots, campus rebellions, most notably, as we've already mentioned, Columbia University, then the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, and the riots at the Democratic National Convention, all within the context of a general rise of crime. The crime rate almost doubled in the 1960s. It increased 98% between 1960 and 1968. The campaign was increasingly less and less about Vietnam and more about the war at home. Alabama Governor George Wallace openly exploited this strict law and order agenda. He ran on a strict law and order agenda. Wallace's shtick was a thinly veiled anti-African American campaign. Maybe not so thinly veiled. Wallace was the Alabama governor who declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. In short, and you can see some echoes in 2020, Wallace blamed Black Americans and Northern liberals for the increasing lawlessness in American society. By September, Wallace's polling numbers peaked at 22%. To his credit, Richard Nixon refused to out-Wallace Wallace. Nixon ran a much subtler, much more effective pro-law and order campaign, as we saw with that picture of the ad, attacking crime in the streets, campus unrest, and civil insurrection. He argued, as I said earlier, the first duty of government was to protect its citizens and uphold the laws. The latter was a key component of his Southern strategy. By implying he would go slow on civil rights, Nixon sought to woo disaffected white Southerners away from the Democrats to his emerging Republican majority. He succeeded. The key civil rights insights from 1968 are the rise of the new Republicans in the South, the beginning of a retreat on civil rights, the lasting legacy of the Wallace campaign, which provides a glimpse of two futures, Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump. Why number 3? Women's rights morphs into women's liberation. In 1968, there were 3 pivotal moments with lasting implications for women's rights. Founded in 1967 by Robin Morgan, Carol Hannish, Shulamith Firestone, and Kathy Sarachild, on January 15, 1968, the New York Radical Women's Coalition counter-protested the Jeannette Rankin Brigade. Jeannette Rankin was the first woman ever elected to Congress. She was a suffragette. Jeannette Rankin and the Jeannette Rankin Brigade, on January 15, 1968, the 86-year-old Jeannette Rankin led a 25,000-person strong anti-war demonstration on Capitol Hill, which the New York Radical Women's Coalition counter-protested. The brigade was an anti-Vietnam War protest. The Radical Women's Coalition protested that Rankin, Coretta Scott King, Judy Collins, and all were too ladylike in their protest. As a counter-protest at Arlington National Cemetery, the coalition staged a mock funeral procession, protesting against traditional womanhood, lamenting womanhood's traditional role, which encourages men to develop aggression to prove their masculinity. In the flyer she wrote promoting the coalition's protest, Kathy Sarachild coined the phrase, "Sisterhood is powerful." That September, at the Miss America pageant, in Atlantic City in September, at the Miss America pageant, the New York Radical Women's Coalition mounted a protest against Miss America as degrading to American women. Contrary to legend, they did not burn their bras, but they did symbolically throw a number of items symbolizing female oppression, including bras and girdles, into a large freedom trash can. At the closing session on Saturday night, during the winner's acceptance speech, they unfurled a banner proclaiming women's liberation. That attracted national news coverage. As Carol Hannish later remarked, the media picked up on the bra part. We often say that if they'd called us girdle burners, every woman in America would have run to join us. Third, on November 27th, 1968, the first National Women's Liberation Conference was held in Chicago. Other than the false myth of bra burning, in 1968, the women's movement went largely unremarked, somewhat lost amid the era's more violent images. Still, those women set in motion a series of events that changed American culture more profoundly, I believe more positively, than anything else that happened in 1968. Although there's, as any woman will tell you, a considerable amount of work still to be done, because of what they set in motion, this slide would have been literally impossible in 1968. Not kind of difficult, literally impossible. A real quick rundown. It's Mary Barra, the Chief Executive Officer of General Motors, Sheryl Sandberg, the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, Alana Howard, the Dean of the School of Robotics and Artificial Intelligence at Georgia Tech, my friend Judy Snyder, who is the president or just retired as the president of Case Western Reserve University. And I'm sure most Erieites know these two ladies. We don't often think of ourselves in Erie as having our finger on the pulse of the future, although we might, Ben, have had it with this 68 stuff. But in any event, for a brief, not for a brief moment, for a 12-year period in the late 80s and 1990s, Erie and Judy Lynch and Joyce Savacchio, all three of us have talked about this, but none of us are sure it's absolutely true. So I'll say it. They're too modest to say it. As far as we can tell, that is the first time a major metropolitan area, and I'm going to give Erie the benefit of the doubt and call it a major metropolitan area. It'd be one of the 250, 300 largest ones in the country. For a moment in time, the two highest elective offices were both simultaneously held by a woman. And of course, one of those is still held by a woman, County Executive Kathy Dahlkemper. Why number 4? The counterculture. Well, what can one say about the counterculture in 5 minutes? The 60s as a cultural phenomenon refers to that period roughly between fall 1964's free speech movement at Berkeley and the last helicopter leaving Saigon in 1975. And in fact, on a socio-cultural level, most of the things that people ascribe to the 60s actually happened in the early 70s. But regardless, the 60s as a cultural phenomenon, 1968 was the hinge year. The 60s changed America in ways both trivial and ephemeral, both subtle and profound, both negative and positive. In a recent book notes, I reviewed Brian Gibney's Generation of Sociopaths, about how the baby boomers allegedly betrayed America. And Gibney's, one of his interesting observations, which I had been working on, and I agree with him, is I made the comment that I believe actually this presentation, but doing the 6-hour version actually at the Jefferson, an audience member asked me when it was over, whatever happened to the counterculture, and I very quickly and erroneously said they lost. Well, I was wrong. The counterculture, at least the do your own thing part, got co-opted and has become down to the present a governing, not governing in the sense of politics, a major cultural influence resulting in the hyper-individualism that in some ways besets our culture. In any event, back to the 60s, as Bob Dylan said, the times they were a-changing, and as this slide shows, there were at least 2 views of the 60s. Greil Marcus, a great rock and roll historian, said it was a time when people stepped outside of themselves and acted as public who didn't know what would happen next, but were sure their acts taken with risk and fear would produce something different from what they had been raised to take for granted. That's the positive view. A negative view from a person who is himself controversial, Jordan Peterson, says that it was a time where there was a disbelief in the existence of competent power and the inability to distinguish between the chaos of immaturity and responsible freedom. So which of those 2 is right? I would say actually they're both right. And that would be an interesting discussion. The counterculture. Driven by the children of prosperity, the counterculture grew out of the Vietnam War protests, which themselves were inspired by Black student sit-ins and protests in the South, and then morphed into a general protest against materialism. Following Emerson's lead, they sought the blessed magic within each person. Like Whitman, they wanted to celebrate myself and sing of myself, and to do, in the parlance of the time, to do their own thing. Escaping into a soft haze, seeking enlightenment in a hash pipe, seeking fulfillment in back to the earth communal living, seeking solace in experimental relationships, seeking grace in Eastern religion, seeking satisfaction, of which Mick Jagger famously said he couldn't get no. It defined a whole era. What are the sub-themes? Well, one of the major sub-themes, and we are fighting about this to this day in America, was the sexual revolution. And for the younger members of the audience, it's almost impossible somehow to understand the difference between today and as recently as 50 years ago. I include some names here of people. I mean, Hugh Hefner is not really of that era, but in the 50s, he actually brought sex out of the closet, by which I don't mean, I mean sex just generically, and talked about it openly, which broke a lot of taboos. William Reich and Norman O. Brown are a couple of interesting people. But the most important thing that happened in the 60s, and it's important in 1968 because it was in 1968 the Pope issued his encyclical In Humana Vitae, in which he condemned artificial birth control. The most important thing that happened in the 60s in terms of the sexual revolution was the pill, which sometimes some commentators, I have actually made this comment, don't usually, and don't often, in fact, I've never gotten any pushback on it. Audiences tend to agree with me, particularly audiences of a certain vintage who have some perspective, that the invention of the birth control pill, and that Enovid on your screen is the original birth control pill, is an invention in human history, somewhat on the same plane of importance with whoever it was that first invented artificial fire. And by artificial fire, I mean whoever it was who figured out that by chipping a stone and getting a spark and letting it hit brush, you could create fire, or by rubbing sticks together, you could create fire. That changed, and that happened, you know, in the long forgotten, in the gone mists of history. There's no way of knowing when that happened. But for the first time in the entire history of the species, women could control their fertility with a reasonably high degree of accuracy without resort to vinegar-soaked sponges and various and sundry other things. That changed everything in ways that we are still trying to figure out today. In fact, I would argue that in the women's rights movement morphing into women's liberation, those two things go hand in hand. By being able to control their fertility is one of the most powerful things empowering women and freeing them from the tyranny of biology, to coin a phrase. Drugs. I mean, it was the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It begins way back in the 50s with the Beats, Ken Kesey and Neil Cassidy, the Merry Pranksters. Killer Weed was considered, there's a government anti-marijuana ad. Timothy Leary and Richard Elbert in the Millbrook Commune. Turn on, tune in, drop out. The notion being turn on by heightening your sensitivity and your awareness, by expanding your consciousness, with therefore enabling you to turn into what is really real, and dropping out of artificial society. There was also a serious religious movement. If the acid generation was seeking enlightenment in its pharmacopoeia, the acid generation also sought enlightenment in new spiritual forms. And those new spiritual forms were drug-induced in some ways. Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, in which he was tracing out his mescaline experiments. A famous rock group of that era took their name from that book, The Doors. Go figure. Siddhartha Hess, that was a major campus bestseller of the era. It's a novelized biography of Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha. Hermann Hesse's other novel, Hesse was a big deal, which actually floored many students of German literature because he was a very straight, very stuffy guy. But his other novel, Steppenwolf, with Harry Haller, the man who's outside of the outsider, and therefore with his special knowledge of society. And then, of course, Richard Elbert, who was Timothy Leary's colleague at Harvard, in his reincarnation as Baba Ramdas, founded a religious movement that is a kind of eclectic blend of Western and Eastern religions. And I give Richard Elbert this: unlike Timothy Leary, who later recanted, Richard Elbert took it all the way out. And the most famous of the works not by Richard Elbert, of course, was "Be Here Now." And that phrase, of course, becomes part of the lexicon of the era. Not so noted was something that actually happened in December 1965, but then slid into 1968, and this is an actual shot from the beach in California, the beginning of the Jesus movement, and the beginning of what religious scholars call the Fourth Great Awakening, the evangelical revival, the repercussions of which reverberate, obviously, down to today. There was also a wonderful blooming of civic involvement, and accepting of one's responsibility to contribute positively The Peace Corps and Vista spoke to that. There was also, I haven't really touched much upon the counterculture and the culture of political protest, the anti-war movement and the protest in favor of enhanced civil rights. By 1968-69, particularly 1968, the Democratic National Convention, 1968, the Columbia Uprising, when SDS, which had in its original incarnation been an aggressive socialist, if you will, advocate for cultural change, although if you read the Port Huron statement today, it actually seems fairly moderate. Politics has kind of passed it by. But by 68, 69, that had morphed into the Weathermen and an out-and-out attempt at revolution. Obviously, the revolution failed. There's Mark Rudd, who's led the Columbia uprisings, Bernadine Dorn, John Jacobs and others, the Weather Underground, who took their name from a Bob Dylan song, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." And they were another part of all of that. And all of this, as I said, and it's going to be hard to go over this, we're going to do this quickly without the music, all of this occurred to a soundtrack. One of the great causes, or I'm searching the word cause, instigators, genocide, progenitors. I'm not coming up with the right noun, but one of the major cultural things was actually the invention of the transistor radio. And the transistor radio, which to the generation of iPod users and MP3 players and music on demand, whatever it is you want to hear, they will seem quite antique. But that was the first time that you could actually take your music with you. Prior to that, recorded music, of course, is a 20th century phenomenon. You had records, and you had radio, but radios were big, cumbersome things, and you couldn't take record players with you. But you could take your transistor radio and put a radio in a car. What a concept! And basically live out your life to a soundtrack. And that is a change. Well, in any event, like I said, two things, maybe three. It's not possible to do this portion justice without the music, so I'm going to go over this kind of quickly and come to an issue that I think is important. But real quickly, the music tied everything together, and people of a certain generation, and I've spent a lot of time in Erie, Cleveland, Buffalo, all along the south shore of Lake Erie, and there was a common culture. In Cleveland in the 60s, WIXY, Wixie 1260 was the big radio station. In Erie, of course, I'm showing the cursor over, it was Jet. But one of the things, interestingly enough, that tied it all together was, in the days of AM radio, was CKLW from Windsor, Ontario. And they were the great exponents of Motown. Now, how does an AM radio get to Erie, Pennsylvania, and Cleveland? AM radio travels through direct site tower to receiver, and it has a range of about 100 miles max, but it also goes through ground waves. There happens to be an incredible conductor between Detroit, Cleveland, and Erie. It's called Lake Erie, an almost perfect conductor. So the dominant radio station of that era, bonding, if you will, youth culture into one common culture, was CKLW. And probably the best depiction of it, and I'm going to try not to start it, I do by accident, was George Lucas's 1972 film, American Graffiti. And if we had the music, I would play this, and the whole point of this, and I'm going to let it run even without the music for about 10 seconds. I'm listening to Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good. You're not unfortunately hearing anything. The whole point of this is that all of these kids and all of these cars are listening to the same music, which created youth culture. And a real quick history of rock and roll. Rock and roll comes out of black rhythm and blues, comes out of rockabilly. Sam Phillips had Sun Records in Memphis, always thought he could make a fortune if he could find a good-looking white guy who sounded black. He did. His name was Elvis Presley, and that gave rise to the explosion of rock and roll, which does have some Lake Erie connections and Erie, Cleveland connections, because Alan Freed, a DJ at WJW Radio in Cleveland, coined the phrase, rock and roll, and he held the first rock and roll concerts where we bring acts in, which is the reason why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's in Cleveland. But by the late 50s, early 60s, there was a counter movement, the folkies, mostly forgotten today, and there was even a television show called Hootenanny. And of course, the most famous folk singer of that era, with the connections to the previous era, was Pete Seeger. But the most important part of the folk movement was it segued into protest songs. And I found this on the web recently, doing this from something called Culture Sonar, the 10 top protest songs of the 60s. Bob Dylan, Only a Pawn in Their Game, Phil Oakes, I Ain't Marching Anymore, Aretha Franklin, one of my favorites, Country Joe and the Fish, I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die Rag, James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. I would disagree with this listing because I'd also say Bob Dylan, and I'm a Bob Dylan fan of sorts. Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind, The Times They Are a-Changin', the Eight Masters of War, and a number of others would probably make that cut. And then, of course, the music continued with the British invasion, changed everything, black music. And you can actually see the split in American culture because by 1968, country goes pop. And bluegrass to rockabilly to Glenn Campbell, who had, as by the time I get to Phoenix. The thing I would actually like to bring up and point out is, as I think about all of this, the sociocultural implications of it, Steven Pinker in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, asked the question, oh my God, could our parents have been right? Is it possible to build a culture based on sustained protest and disdain for all values and all traditional values? Rock, in its very nature, is a music of protest, not necessarily political or culture, but a rejection of what came before. There are very few, in rock, in all of its permutations, and I'm using rock as a phrase to cover every possible permutation, that there's one thing common to all of them. No one covers other people's music. Everything has to be new and original and raw and first. In jazz, the whole art of jazz is to take somebody else's thing and show another way to do it. Similarly, in high music, high music's the wrong phrase. In classical music, the musicologists in the audience are starting to wince. But in orchestral music, that's not even a good phrase. The notion is how to perform something that's been done before perfectly. Rock is completely different. The aesthetic is new, creative, raw, original. Don't look back. You can't build a society on an absence of stability. Media. Looking at the clock, I want to get done with this. A couple of books every American should read. Daniel Burstyn in The Image, I referred to it earlier, posited the notion of pseudo-events and the triumph of image over reality in American culture. Marshall McLuhan, a book that if you have insomnia, this is the book for you. You won't get past page 30. But if you're intensely interested in media, you'll labor through it because I always think of McLuhan like Columbus and Floyd. He got almost all the details wrong, but he got the big thing right. And the big thing that he got right is another book before I leave this slide, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, is back to image. The lack of taking seriously, and Roger Ailes' notion that politicians will turn into performers. What McLuhan got right is channel here in a basic communications model. Channel means medium. And McLuhan's great observations is that channels, media, are not neutral. They impose their own biases. They change everything. Right now, we're living through a media-induced cultural revolution because we don't know what to make of social media. We don't know how to control it. And if you don't think that social media is important and that this is all academic, think of what the invention of the book did. It set off 150 to 200 years of war between Protestants and Catholics. What did Burstyn mean by the image? He meant that metaphors for reality supersede reality. I always use this example. Now, most people will look at that and say, that's a statue of John Wayne. And you're right, that's a statue of John Wayne. But where is it? It's in the lobby of the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. Now, John Wayne was not a cowboy. John Wayne played cowboys. John Wayne's real name was Marion Morrison. His father was a pharmacist. He grew up in Glendale, California. He went to Southern California University on a football scholarship, hurt his back surfing, lost his football scholarship. The young John Wayne, some people might find this hard to believe, was an extremely good-looking young man. He decided to go over to Hollywood. This is all happening in the early 1920s, see if he could make some money as an extra, and he got a career as an actor. Then the rest, as I say, is history, because he played cowboys and became the cowboy. Now, most cowboys, and this is important to the American story, most cowboys were in fact migrant agricultural workers. They were largely Irish immigrants and African-American fugitive slaves, and then after the Civil War, African-Americans fleeing the Black Codes, because the only place they had any kind of half-decent chance at just being their own person was the West. But that gets all submerged in image. And I threw this in, we don't have time to get into it. And what does image do? You take a young girl from Bakersfield, California, and you turn her into a movie star, and over time she becomes an icon that has very little to do with the young woman from Bakersfield, California. 1968 was the year, in my argument, that America passed some cusp on the arc of mediation, when it began to lose touch with the young girl from Bakersfield, California, and only saw the icon. Media, media, media. It's extremely important. So, 1968, the year America shattered. What shattered? The American story, which I'm now picking up on the American Tapestry Project on August 11th. Ben and I will be back here doing yet another Zoom session, which I'm watching my clock. I know I'm a little bit over, but I've actually jammed a lot in here, hopefully not talking too fast. What shattered? The American story. So what is the American story? Today's New York Times, right today, July, whatever it is, 7th, 2020. If you subscribe to the New York Times and you get the newsletter, the lead article was, what is the American story? Well, Ben and I have been on this for 3 or 4 years, and we will explore this further in a subsequent session. So, Christmas Eve, 1968, I'd play the video for you, but we're out of time. But that is the far side of the moon. And if I let the video run for a little, the Earth would rise over in the background. So that's it. Went over by about 3 or 4 minutes, Ben.
Andy, I was going to say, I don't think you took a breath during the entire thing. That was incredibly impressive and amazing to cover that much ground in that little of a time. I know I gave you a nearly insurmountable task, but you did it. We do have time for an audience question, and I want to read this one. There's a bit of a statement and then followed by a question. And Andy, I think that it's drawing back to where we began, that look at 1968 under the lens of the year we're living through right now in 2020. And you covered so much in the parallels that we can draw between now and then. This person from our audience says it was a tumultuous time. What if we could have layered today's media, talk news, and social media reach on top of the events of that time? So trying to just imagine the amplification of 1968 with the technology we have. And you talked about living that out in real time with social media right now. It would have certainly rivaled the seemingly hourly chaos of today, this person writes, and then asks, would any events have taken a different turn or different outcome in your observation? What do you make of that? Do you think things, how different might have things been?
That's a great question. There's a lot to unpack in that question.
I know, it's a great one.
I think actually, boy, that is a great question. That deserves some thought. 1968, as I said, was so chaotic. It was so crazy. But to a certain extent, it was slower. There was no email. There was no text. There was no instant messaging. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram. There was no TikTok. So there would be these incredible eruptions, the assassination of King, then rapidly followed by that's how Johnson got the Fair Housing Act passed. Ironically, because the Republicans were afraid he'd get something even more radical if they didn't give him that. Then you have the assassination of Kennedy. Then you have the riots. Then you have, I think if we'd had then, modern today, 2020s, media platforms, it had been even more chaotic. so far, I don't know. That is a really good question, because in some ways, the voices that got drowned out by the violent images would actually be heard. And there might have been a bit more, ironically enough, a bit more reflection, a bit more taking a pause, because the voices that got drowned out, the voices of not so much moderation, but the voices of asking second questions might have better been heard. I know that is a terrific question.
Yeah, and a big
I
shout
don't
out
really
to
have an answer to that.
Yeah, a big shout out to Art Leopold for asking that. Art, we appreciate you, appreciate that. And I think it's a great question. Andy, that's, I think a program in and of itself is thinking about how we might look at that differently.
Well,
Because
that
I know
would tie into the mediated America, because one of the things that would be different is the best movie about mediated America relevant to 1968 is Haskell Wexler's Medium Cool. The movie was made in 1970, but it's about 1968. And the biggest difference is, when I say other voices might have been heard, Wexler uses this, which of course, as any photographer will know what I'm doing, or videographer, you're framing the image. Well, you only see what the camera's looking at. But in the age of these, when everybody's walking around with a movie camera with very high resolution, and it's also sound, then there are more people seeing what's going on outside. That's a great question. I have to think about that.
Well, I think that ties right back to a lot of what you talk about with media. I know when you dig into the individual sections, one of the things that I appreciate, framing for 1968 compared to today is a look at just how we digested the news. There is no Walter Cronkite today. Instead, we just have TVs that sometimes have upwards of 500 plus channels, and not all of them are dedicated to news, but you can pick your flavor of news. It's nearly a Baskin Robbins approach to, you have so many options that you can pick exactly what you want. In 1968, it wasn't that way. And I think that you holding up your cell phone and saying that is a great point, that with social media platforms, we've become producers of content ourselves. Right. And not everyone's a trained journalist, not everyone's a trained newsmaker, but still has the ability to capture news that is real events and then share that. And to think what the 1968 might have looked like had that technology existed, I think is a fantastic topic. It's something that we could explore in later.
I want to think about that some more. My first reaction would be, I think it would have been more chaotic, because one of the things that was true then is, you just touched on it, there were only 3 television, well, 4. Public television, though, was at NET was in its infancy, so there were only 3. And the editorial function in news was still taken very seriously. You just made the comment. There's no one in American culture today who has the respect and authority that Walter Cronkite, correctly or incorrectly, I think largely correctly, he was a man of integrity. He wasn't always right, and he would tell you I wasn't always right, but you never doubted the integrity of where he was trying to come from. And when he came back from Vietnam in February and said, "This is a hopeless stalemate, well, I don't know what we're doing," Lyndon Johnson is famously quoted to have remarked, "If I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the country." There is no one today in that plethora of cable news talking heads, much less social media platforms, who has that kind of gravitas that across the political spectrum people would pay attention to and respect, who could kind of calm things down and frame a discussion.
Well, I can't help but think too, you have to wonder what a 1968 with a Richard Nixon with a smartphone in his hand and Twitter at his disposal might also look like. And then if that's not enough, what a George Wallace would look like on social media as well, and how that might have changed the landscape. Plenty to unpack. Dr. Roth, I can't wait to get back here and do these individual sections where we can really bust that out and have a meatier discussion about things like media and take a look at this. Such a critical time to take a look at 1968 in respect to 2020, as we live through a year that so many people are now reflecting on in 1968, drawing comparisons to 2020. how we lived through then, how we are living through now, what we had learned, what we ignored from 1968, and what we're taking a look at today. So a big thank you to you, Dr. Roth, for providing
you,
all
Ben.
of your insight, observation, and knowledge on that. Learning so much. So we are grateful for you. And a big thanks to all of you tuning in and watching along at home. Thank you. To read Dr. Andrew Roth's book notes, head over to the Jefferson's website at www.jeserie.org. There you will also find videos of past presentations, including one that Dr. Roth and I had where we talked about that article that Andy had mentioned earlier that James Fallows wrote for The Atlantic about 1968 and 2020. But you'll also find a bunch of other videos from past programs, and you'll see announcements for upcoming programs as well on our website. And you'll also find a whole host of publications looking at a wide range of issues, again, at jeserie.org. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.
Thank you, Ben.